The morning of September 19th, 1944. Dense fog blankets the rolling hills near Haraucourt, France, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. Sergeant Jim Bauer from Ohio sits in the commander's cupola of his M4 Sherman, straining to hear engine sounds through the mist. His 75mm gun is loaded with an unusual round, one never intended for killing tanks. It's a white phosphorus shell, designed by Army Ordnance as an artillery marker to help spot targets for howitzers. In 60 seconds, Bauer's tank will open fire on a German Panther tank he cannot see, will never see during the entire engagement, and will knock it out completely, using a weapon that was never designed to penetrate armor. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The battle about to unfold will force American tank doctrine to confront an uncomfortable truth. For the past 2 years, Sherman crews had been taught that fighting German heavy tanks was suicide, that their 75mm guns couldn't penetrate Panther or Tiger armor from any angle except the sides and rear at close range. The official solution was simple: avoid tank-on-tank combat. Let the tank destroyers handle enemy armor while Shermans supported infantry. But in the fog-shrouded fields of Lorraine, far from the theorists at Army Ground Forces headquarters in Washington, Sherman crews were about to discover something revolutionary. When you couldn't see your enemy, when their superior range and armor became meaningless, when smoke and fog transformed the battlefield into a series of point-blank ambushes, the Sherman tank could win. More than win, it could dominate. The transformation wouldn't come from better guns or thicker armor. It would come from understanding that in armored warfare, as in all combat, seeing the enemy first and controlling what the enemy could see often mattered more than the thickness of steel or the velocity of shells. And white phosphorus smoke, that humble artillery marker, would become the most feared weapon in the Sherman arsenal against Tigers and Panthers, not because it could penetrate their armor, but because it could blind them, choke them, and transform their technical superiority into a liability. Sergeant Jim Bauer had been commanding Sherman tanks for 8 months, when Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division rolled into defensive positions around Haraucourt on September 14th, 1944. At 24, the former auto mechanic from Columbus had survived the breakthrough at Saint-Lô, the race across France, and enough near misses to understand that luck was a resource that depleted with every engagement. His crew of 4 other men, all under 26, had been together since the division shipped to France in July. Driver, bow gunner, gunner, loader. They knew each other's movements, could reload and fire in 12 seconds, and had developed the automatic coordination that kept crews alive when German 88mm guns could kill at 2,000 yards. The Sherman Bauer commanded was an M4A1, the early production model with a cast hull, and the original 75mm M3 gun. Army Ordnance designated it as inadequate for fighting German heavy tanks. Every tanker in the Third Army knew it. The Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate 88mm of vertical armor at 100 yards. The Panther tank had 100mm of armor over its frontal glacis plate, sloped at 55 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of 185mm. The Tiger 100mm of flat frontal armor. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Sherman against Panther or Tiger from the front, at normal combat ranges, was a losing proposition. The official doctrine, refined through 2 years of combat in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, acknowledged this reality. Tank destroyers, specifically the M10 and M18, with their 3-inch guns, were designated as the primary anti-tank weapons. Shermans focused on infantry support, using high-explosive shells to demolish strongpoints and machine gun nests. When Shermans did encounter enemy tanks, the prescribed tactic was flanking maneuvers. One section of a 5-tank platoon would draw enemy fire, while another section maneuvered to attack from the sides or rear, where German armor was thinner. The problem with official doctrine was that it assumed visibility. It assumed open terrain where flanking maneuvers were possible. It assumed that Sherman crews would have time and space to execute complex tactical movements while under fire from guns that could kill at ranges where Shermans couldn't shoot back effectively. and it completely failed to account for what happened when weather and terrain transformed the battlefield into something doctrine never contemplated. The Lorraine region in eastern France, where Combat Command A had driven its defensive positions, was agricultural country, gently rolling hills broken by small villages and patches of forest. In mid-September, the weather had turned. Cool nights produced heavy morning fog that filled the low-lying areas and reduced visibility to nearly zero. The fog typically persisted until noon, when rising temperatures burned it off. For tankers used to fighting in the open country of northern France, the fog was an alien environment that negated every advantage they had developed over the summer of breakout and pursuit. But the fog affected German tanks even more severely. The superior optics that gave Panthers and Tigers their long-range killing power became useless when visibility shrank to 50 yards or less. The Zeiss TZF-12, a gun sight mounted in Panthers, with its 2.5 power magnification and precise ranging capability, couldn't engage targets it couldn't see. German doctrine emphasized long-range engagement, using superior armor and firepower to destroy Allied tanks before they could close to effective range. In the fog, that doctrine evaporated. What Bauer and his fellow Sherman commanders didn't yet understand on the morning of September 14th was that they were about to face the largest German armored counteroffensive on the Western Front since D-Day. 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, had been assembling forces throughout the first 2 weeks of September. 262 tanks and assault guns, including 75 Panzer Mark IVs and 107 Panther tanks. The objective was to recapture Lunéville and eliminate the American bridgehead over the Moselle River, cutting off Third Army's spearhead and forcing General George Patton to abandon his drive toward the German border. German commanders anticipated quick victory. They had numerical superiority in tanks. They had newer, more powerful vehicles. The 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A held a dangerously exposed position, a salient projecting east toward the German lines with vulnerable flanks. Standard armored doctrine suggested the Americans should be overwhelmed within 24 hours. Intelligence reports indicated the defending force had only 71 Shermans and 18 tank destroyers immediately available, less than one-third of the German strength. What German intelligence failed to account for was terrain knowledge, defensive preparation, and the tactical implications of weather. Combat Command A had spent 4 days preparing defensive positions, identifying key terrain features, and positioning its outnumbered tanks to exploit the rolling countryside. Sherman tanks occupied concealed positions on reverse slopes and in tree lines, invisible until German armor closed to point-blank range. Tank destroyer platoons covered key approaches with overlapping fields of fire. Artillery. Forward observers had registered targets throughout the area, ready to deliver immediate fire support. And then there was the ammunition mix in every Sherman tank. Standard combat load was 71 rounds of 75mm ammunition. Typically, this consisted of 48 high-explosive shells for use against infantry and soft targets, 12 armor-piercing rounds for fighting tanks, 6 smoke rounds, and 5 white phosphorus rounds. The white phosphorus shells, designated M48, had been developed as artillery spotting rounds. When they burst, they produced billowing clouds of white smoke that allowed forward observers to mark targets for indirect fire. But American tank crews had discovered another use for white phosphorus during the fighting in Normandy. When fired directly at German tanks, the burning phosphorus created effects that went far beyond simple smoke generation. The chemical burned at over 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, producing white-hot fragments that adhered to metal surfaces and continued burning for several minutes. More importantly, the acrid smoke was drawn into German tanks through their ventilation systems, filling crew compartments with choking fumes. Panther and Tiger crews, feeling smoke enter their vehicles and seeing white flames on their hull or turret, often assumed their tank was on fire and abandoned it immediately. German tanks were particularly vulnerable to this psychological effect because of their excellent but temperamental engineering. Panthers and Tigers had complex ventilation systems that drew air through filters in the engine compartment and distributed it throughout the crew space to keep crews comfortable during extended combat operations. When white phosphorus smoke entered these systems, it filled the fighting compartment within seconds. Crews trained to fear above all things the horror of burning alive in a sealed metal box would bail out rather than risk being trapped if the tank actually ignited. There were recorded instances from Normandy where white phosphorus shells had defeated Panthers without penetrating their armor at all. The burning phosphorus would blind the tank's optics, making aiming impossible. The smoke would choke the crew, forcing them to either open hatches, making them vulnerable to machine gun fire, or abandon the vehicle entirely. And even if the crew stayed inside, the white-hot fragments would damage external equipment, sights, machine guns, and in some cases even ignite fuel or ammunition stored in external bins. Bauer had 5 white phosphorus rounds in his Sherman's ammunition storage, loaded in quick-access racks near the loader's position. He had never fired one in combat. The tank commander who briefed him back in Normandy had mentioned them as a last-ditch weapon if you encountered a tiger at close range and had no other option. The advice had been delivered with gallows humor. Won't penetrate, but might convince the Kraut bastards their tank is burning. If that fails, reverse gear is your friend. The first German assault came at Lunéville on September 18th, 4 miles south of Bauer's position at Aracourt. The 111th Panzer Brigade, newly formed and equipped with Panther tanks, struck at the 4th Armoured Division's Reserve Command and the Corps Reconnaissance Group. In sharp, confused fighting through fog and rain, American forces destroyed 24 panzers, but the ferocity of the attack made it clear this was no local counterattack. By nightfall on September 18th, Combat Command A received warning orders that a major German offensive was developing and that the main blow would likely fall on their exposed position the following morning. Bauer and his crew spent the night of September 18th preparing their tank for what was coming. They topped off fuel tanks, checked ammunition, tested radios and intercoms, verified that all weapons were clean and functioning. The gunner, Corporal Danny Ross from Kentucky, meticulously cleaned the telescopic sight and checked the gun's elevation and traverse mechanisms. The loader, Private First Class Mike Chen from California, organized ammunition for quick access, positioning armor-piercing rounds where he could reach them instantly if they encountered German tanks. The bow gunner, Private Tommy Walsh from New York, cleaned both the bow-mounted 30-caliber machine gun and the coaxial machine gun mounted beside the main gun. And the driver, Private Eddie Kowalski from Michigan, performed the ritual maintenance that kept the Sherman's radial engine running, checking oil levels, testing controls, ensuring the tank could move instantly when ordered. Each man knew his job perfectly. They had worked together long enough that verbal orders were often unnecessary. As darkness fell, Bauer briefed his crew on what to expect. German tanks would likely attack at dawn, using morning fog for concealment. The Sherman's position was on a slight rise overlooking an open field, good defensive terrain that gave them observation when visibility permitted. If Panthers or Tigers appeared, the plan was simple. Let them close to point-blank range before opening fire. Aim for side armor if possible. If forced to engage frontally, use white phosphorus first to blind them, then maneuver for a better shot. The instructions felt inadequate against what was coming, and Bauer knew it. His crew knew it. But they were tankers, professionals who understood that inadequate plans executed with skill beat perfect plans that never left the briefing tent. And they had one advantage the Germans didn't. They knew exactly where they were, had prepared positions, understood the terrain, and could use the fog that would cloak German movements as cover for their own maneuvers. The morning of September 19th dawned cold and wet, with fog so thick that Bauer couldn't see his hand at arm's length. He stood in the commander's cupola, hatches open despite the cold, listening to sounds carried through the mist. Somewhere beyond visual range, German tanks were moving into position. He could hear the distant rumble of heavy engines, the metallic clink of tracks on road surfaces, the occasional barked command in German. The enemy was close, perhaps within 200 yards, completely invisible in the murk. At 0800 hours, German artillery opened fire, shells screaming overhead to impact in Aracourt behind Combat Command A's forward positions. The barrage lasted 10 minutes, a preparatory bombardment designed to suppress American defenders before the armor attacked. Bauer buttoned up, closing his cupola hatch, cutting off the outside world, except for what he could see through the narrow vision slits. Inside the Sherman, in the familiar smell of oil, cordite, and sweat, the crew waited. The first contact came at 08:15, when one of the forward observation posts reported German armor approaching from the east. Bauer's radio crackled with fragmentary reports. Panthers visible through breaks in the fog, estimated company strength, moving toward the American positions in column formation. Standard German assault doctrine. Use the fog for concealment, then break into assault formations once they locate the American defenses. It was tactically sound against an enemy you could see. Against concealed defenders with prepared positions, it was a recipe for disaster. Bauer saw the first Panther at 08:23. It appeared suddenly through the fog at less than 100 yards, its long-barreled 75mm gun swiveling as the commander searched for targets. The tank was buttoned up, hatches closed, crew operating on internal vision only through periscopes that could see perhaps 30 yards in good conditions. In the fog, the Panther crew was essentially blind, advancing into terrain they didn't know, looking for an enemy they couldn't locate. Ross, the gunner, tracked the Panther's movement through his telescopic sight. At this range, a side shot with armor-piercing ammunition might penetrate, but the Panther was angled, its sloped side armor presenting more than 70mm of effective thickness. An uncertain shot at best, and if they missed, if the round ricocheted or failed to penetrate, the Panther would locate them instantly, traverse its superior gun, and kill them with a single round. Bauer made a decision that would have earned him a reprimand in training, but made perfect sense in the chaos of combat. "Load Willie Pete," he ordered, using the tanker's slang for white phosphorus. Chen moved instantly, extracting an armor-piercing round from the gun breech and replacing it with the white phosphorus shell. "Willie Pete, loaded," he confirmed. "Aim for the hull, center mass," Bauer said. "Fire when ready." Ross adjusted his aim, compensating for the Sherman's position on the slight rise, leading the Panther's movement by perhaps one tank length. The mathematics of deflection shooting at point-blank range. When the sight picture looked right, he fired. The 75mm gun erupted with familiar violence, the Sherman rocking back on its suspension as the shell left the barrel at 1,800 feet per second. The white phosphorus round struck the Panther's hull just below the turret ring. For a fraction of a second, nothing seemed to happen. Then the shell burst, and suddenly the German tank was covered in brilliant white flames. Burning phosphorus fragments stuck to the armor, creating dozens of individual fires that burned with impossible intensity. White smoke began pouring from the impact point, thick and acrid, rapidly obscuring the entire tank from view. Through his periscope, Bauer watched the Panther's reaction. The tank lurched to a stop. The turret traversed wildly, searching for the shooter but blinded by smoke and flames. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then the Panther's hatches flew open and crew members began bailing out, climbing from the turret and dropping to the ground before running toward the German lines through the fog. They abandoned a fully functional tank, undamaged except for cosmetic scarring on its hull, because they believed they were burning alive. Chen had already loaded another round, armor-piercing this time, ready if the Panther stayed in the fight. But the German tank sat abandoned, white smoke still billowing from its hull, a monument to the psychological power of fire. Bauer reported the kill over the radio, his voice professionally calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Around him, across Combat Command A's defensive positions, other Shermans were engaging Panthers that emerged from the fog and vanished back into it like ghosts. The pattern established in those first 15 minutes of combat would define the entire Battle of Aracourt. German tanks advancing blindly through fog, unable to use their superior range and optics. American defenders in prepared positions, waiting until targets closed to point-blank range before opening fire. And white phosphorus shells, creating havoc out of proportion to their actual destructive capability, disabling German tanks through psychological impact rather than physical penetration. But Combat Command A's success wasn't simply a matter of using smoke shells cleverly. It was the culmination of hard lessons learned through 2 years of Sherman crews fighting technologically superior German armor. Lessons paid for with burned crews, knocked-out tanks, and the bitter understanding that American armor doctrine had been wrong about nearly everything that mattered in tank versus tank combat. The Sherman tank that Jim Bower commanded on that foggy September morning was the product of decisions made 3 years earlier, when American tank development was still influenced by peacetime thinking and budget constraints. The M4 medium tank, officially designated as such in 1941, represented a compromise between mobility, firepower, and manufacturing simplicity. It was designed to be producible in massive quantities using automotive industry techniques, reliable enough for sustained operations, and versatile enough to handle multiple roles. The 75mm M3 gun, mounted in early Shermans, was based on a French artillery piece from World War I, upgraded for tank use but fundamentally limited in anti-armor capability. When the Sherman entered combat in North Africa in 1942, its gun was adequate against German Panzer Mark IIIs and early Panzer Mark IVs. The Sherman's armor, 51mm thick on the frontal hull but sloped at 56 degrees for increased effective thickness, could resist fire from German tank guns at moderate ranges, and the tank's reliability, a product of automotive industry expertise, made it vastly more dependable than temperamental German designs. But by 1943, German tank development had accelerated in response to encounters with Soviet 34s and heavy tanks like the KV-1. The Panther tank, entering service in mid-1943, mounted a 75mm gun with vastly greater muzzle velocity than the Sherman's weapon. The Panther's gun could penetrate 185mm of unsloped armor at 100 yards, nearly 3 times what the Sherman could achieve. Coupled with thick, well-sloped armor that made the Panther nearly immune to Sherman fire from the front, the new German tank represented a technological leap that American armor development hadn't anticipated. The Tiger I, entering service even earlier in 1942, was even more formidable. Armed with the legendary 88mm gun, adapted from Germany's most effective anti-aircraft weapon, the Tiger could engage Shermans at 2,000 yards and reliably penetrate their armor. Sherman crews, lucky enough to spot a Tiger first, needed to close to within 100 yards and hit the tank's sides or rear to have any hope of penetration. Hitting a target from the side meant flanking maneuvers under fire from a gun that could kill at 10 times the range. American responses to the Panther and Tiger threat developed slowly and inadequately. The 76mm M1 gun, a higher velocity weapon that could penetrate Panther side armor at combat ranges, didn't reach Europe in significant numbers until late summer 1944. Even then, many tank commanders rejected it because the 76mm high-explosive shells were less effective against infantry than the old 75mm rounds. Tank commanders focused on infantry support saw little reason to trade capability against soft targets for marginally improved performance against tanks they weren't supposed to fight anyway. The British took a more aggressive approach, mounting their powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun in standard Sherman hulls to create the Sherman Firefly. The 17-pounder could penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at reasonable combat ranges and punch through a Tiger I from the front at 1,900 yards. Fireflies were issued 1 per tank troop, hidden among standard Shermans to prevent German crews from targeting them first. But American forces didn't adopt the Firefly in significant numbers, relying instead on tank destroyers and the promise that better tanks were coming. The gap between German and American tank technology created doctrinal problems that couldn't be solved with better tactics alone. Official Army doctrine stated clearly that tanks did not fight tanks. Tank destroyers, built on Sherman chassis but more lightly armored and armed with 3-inch or 90mm guns, were designated as the anti-armor force. Shermans supported infantry, exploited breakthroughs, and avoided direct combat with enemy armor whenever possible. It was logical on paper. In practice, it meant American tank crews went into battle knowing they were outgunned and out-armored by every German tank newer than a Panzer Mark IV. The psychological impact on crews was corrosive. Tankers who survived encounters with Panthers and Tigers returned with stories of shells bouncing off German armor, of being unable to hurt the enemy while watching friends die. The Sherman earned nicknames that reflected this grim reality, Tommy Cooker, among Germans, for the ease with which they set Shermans ablaze. Ronson. Among British crews, after the cigarette lighter that advertised, "Lights first time, every time." American crews were more direct. They called their tanks death traps. The statistics supported the pessimism. Early war studies suggested American tank units were losing 3 to 4 Shermans for every German tank destroyed. Sherman crews in Normandy reported that Panthers and Tigers could engage them at ranges where return fire was impossible. In late summer 1944, after breaking out of the Normandy hedgerows into more open country, American tank units sometimes took 50% casualties before even spotting where enemy fire originated. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Yet beneath these grim statistics, a more complex reality was emerging. The Sherman versus Panther kill ratio that would later be calculated from Third Army records for the period from August 1, 1944 through March 1945 showed something unexpected. Shermans achieved a 3.6 to 1 kill ratio against Panthers. For every Sherman destroyed, American tankers claimed 3.6 Panthers knocked out. This inverted the popular narrative of German technical superiority, translating into battlefield dominance. How was this possible? How could a tank inferior in armor and firepower achieve such favorable results? The answer lay in factors that peacetime theorists and post-war critics often overlooked: crew training, tactical flexibility, air support, and the crucial importance of seeing the enemy first. And in weather conditions like the fog at Aracourt, factors that made German technical advantages irrelevant while amplifying American strengths. Bauer's engagement with that first Panther on September 19th established a pattern that would repeat throughout the day. German tanks appeared from the fog at close range. American tankers hit them with white phosphorus to blind and disorient them. If the Germans bailed out, the abandoned tank was captured. If they stayed and fought, American tanks maneuvered using the fog for concealment, seeking flank shots or calling in artillery and air support once the fog lifted. By 0900 hours, Combat Command A had knocked out or captured 11 German tanks using variations of this tactic. The German offensive, planned as a rapid breakthrough to overwhelm American defenses before air support could intervene, had instead dissolved into a series of confused point-blank engagements where visibility meant more than armor thickness. German commanders, unable to coordinate attacks they couldn't observe, launched piecemeal assaults that American defenders defeated in detail. The fog began lifting around noon, burned off by rising temperatures and autumn sun. With clear visibility came American air power. P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers from the 19th Tactical Air Command had been circling above the fog since mid-morning, waiting for targets. When the battlefield became visible, they dove through broken clouds to attack German armor with rockets, bombs, and machine gun fire. Panthers and Tigers, caught in open fields while maneuvering to regroup, became easy prey for pilots who could attack without fear of effective anti-aircraft fire. Major Charles Carpenter, flying a Piper L-4 Cub observation aircraft armed with bazooka rockets, achieved legendary status that day. When the fog lifted at noon, he spotted a company of Panthers advancing toward Aracourt. Carpenter dove through German ground fire, firing all 6 rockets in a series of low-altitude attacks. He landed, rearmed, and flew 2 more sorties that afternoon, expending a total of 16 rockets. Ground forces later verified that Carpenter had knocked out 2 Panthers and several armored cars while forcing other German tanks to scatter, disrupting their attack entirely. The combination of fog-aided ground defense and air attacks once visibility improved, proved devastating to German plans. By the end of September 19th, 5th Panzer Army had lost over 30 tanks without achieving any significant territorial gains. The psychological impact on German crews was even more damaging than the material losses. They had attacked with numerical and technical superiority, with newer and more powerful tanks, in terrain that should have favored armored operations. They had been defeated by defenders using fog as a weapon, white phosphorus as a psychological terror, and coordinated combined arms tactics that negated every German advantage. German commanders responded to September 19th's failure by ordering renewed attacks for the following day, using the same basic plan. Panthers would advance under cover of morning fog, locate American positions, and destroy them with superior firepower. The persistent fog that had aided American defenders on the 19th was viewed by German planners as an anomaly that wouldn't repeat. It repeated for 5 consecutive days. From September 20th through 25th, 5th Panzer Army launched a series of attacks against Combat Command A's positions at Aracourt. Each assault followed the same pattern. German tanks advanced through morning fog, encountered American defenders in concealed positions, took heavy casualties at point-blank range, and withdrew when the fog lifted and American air power arrived. The Germans lost 36 more tanks during this period, 700 killed, 300 wounded. Combat Command A lost 25 Shermans and 7 tank destroyers, a favorable exchange ratio even without factoring in the attackers' numerical superiority. The white phosphorus tactic that Bauer had used instinctively on September 19th became standard procedure throughout Combat Command A's tank battalions. Commanders briefed crews to open engagements with Willie Pete if facing Panthers or Tigers at close range. The psychological effect was reliable enough that tankers began carrying extra white phosphorus rounds, trading high-explosive shells for smoke to maximize their options in close combat. Gun camera footage and after-action reports documented numerous instances where German crews abandoned perfectly functional tanks after white phosphorus hits, convinced their vehicles were burning. But the effectiveness of white phosphorus went beyond simple psychological impact. The burning chemical created practical problems for German tank crews that went far beyond fear. Panther and Tiger gun sights, among the finest optical instruments in any World War II tank, were useless when covered with burning phosphorus or obscured by smoke. German tanks used prismatic periscopes that extended through the armor to give commanders all-around vision. White phosphorus fragments could damage or destroy these periscopes, leaving the crew blind except for narrow direct vision slits. The ventilation systems that drew white phosphorus smoke into German fighting compartments weren't just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. White phosphorus smoke contains phosphorus pentoxide, which irritates mucous membranes and makes breathing difficult. Inside a sealed tank, with smoke concentrating in the crew compartment, the effect was incapacitating. German crews who stayed inside their tanks after white phosphorus hits reported difficulty seeing, breathing, and communicating, all while trying to fight a battle at point-blank range. Most critically, white phosphorus created a smokescreen that Sherman crews could use tactically. A Panther hit with Willie Pete was immediately obscured by dense white smoke that persisted for several minutes. During this period, the German tank was effectively neutralized. It couldn't see to shoot, couldn't maneuver safely without risking collision, couldn't even retreat with confidence. Sherman crews learned to use this window to reposition, call in support, or maneuver for better shots, while the German crew dealt with the chaos inside their blinded tank. The broader lesson of Aracourt extended beyond white phosphorus tactics to fundamental questions about the relationship between technology and battlefield outcomes. German tanks at Aracourt were technically superior in nearly every measurable way. Thicker armor, more powerful guns, better optics, higher muzzle velocities, yet they lost decisively because their technical advantages were negated by weather, terrain, and American tactical flexibility. Combat Command A's defensive dispositions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of combined arms warfare. Tank destroyers covered key approaches with overlapping fields of fire. Artillery forward observers provided immediate support, often firing directly on enemy tanks once they were spotted. Infantry and engineers held critical terrain and protected tanks from close assault by German panzer grenadiers. And above all, tank commanders used terrain intelligently, positioning Shermans on reverse slopes and in tree lines, where they could engage at close range while remaining concealed until the last moment. The Sherman tank's advantages in this environment were often overlooked by critics who focused on armor and firepower comparisons. The Sherman was reliable. It could move long distances without mechanical failure, allowing rapid repositioning as tactical situations changed. It had a power-traversed turret, allowing gunners to track moving targets faster than German crews using hand-cranked turrets in Panthers. It had excellent crew ergonomics, providing better all-around vision for the commander and more comfortable fighting positions that reduced fatigue during extended combat. Most importantly, Sherman crews at Aracourt were well-trained, experienced veterans who understood their equipment's limitations and capabilities. They had learned through hard combat that frontal engagements with German heavy tanks were suicidal. They had developed tactics that emphasized maneuver, concealment, and combined arms coordination. And when fog provided an equalizer that made German technical superiority irrelevant, they exploited it ruthlessly. By September 29th, when German attacks finally ceased, the Battle of Aracourt was recognized as one of the largest tank battles fought by American forces on the Western Front until the Battle of the Bulge. German forces had committed 262 tanks and assault guns. They lost 200 of them, leaving only 62 operational when the battle ended. Combat Command A lost 32 tanks total. The kill ratio, approximately 6-1 in favor of the defenders, represented a devastating defeat for German armor at a time when Germany couldn't afford such losses. Yet the battle's significance extended beyond mere numbers. Aracourt demonstrated that American tank crews, properly trained and led, fighting from prepared positions with air and artillery support, could defeat German armor despite technological disadvantages. The fog that had seemed like an obstacle to both sides proved to be an asymmetric advantage. It hurt the Germans far more because their entire doctrine was built around long-range engagement using superior optics and powerful guns. And the white phosphorus tactic, discovered almost by accident, provided Sherman crews with a weapon that was effective precisely because it didn't try to match German tanks in armor penetration. Instead of trying to punch through thick German armor with inadequate guns, American crews learned to blind, choke, and terrorize enemy tankers, forcing them to abandon vehicles that were physically undamaged but psychologically untenable. The lessons of Aracourt spread rapidly through Third Army, and eventually throughout American armored forces in Europe. White phosphorus became a standard first-round choice for close-range engagements with heavy German tanks. Smoke tactics generally received more emphasis in training and tactical planning, and the psychological dimensions of armored combat, often dismissed by theorists who focused on material factors, gained recognition as legitimate and effective aspects of tank warfare. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, American tank crews used white phosphorus shells against Tigers and King Tigers with similar success. The tactic was particularly effective in the Ardennes winter conditions, where snow, fog, and limited visibility made long-range engagements impossible. Sherman commanders learned to use the dense forests and narrow roads of the Ardennes to force close-range encounters, where German armor advantages evaporated and American tactical flexibility dominated. The final irony of the white phosphorus story emerged only after the war, when American ordnance officers analyzed ammunition expenditure data from the European theater. White phosphorus shells, originally designated as artillery markers and given low production priority, had been fired in combat at rates far exceeding planned allocation. Tank battalions continuously requested additional Willie Pete, often trading away high-explosive shells to get more smoke rounds. The demand was so persistent that production had to be increased to prevent shortages. A weapon designed as a simple marking round had become one of the most effective anti-tank munitions in the American arsenal, not through armor penetration but through psychological warfare, optical disruption, and tactical smoke generation. The Army ordnance officers who developed the M48 white phosphorus shell in 1942 never imagined Sherman crews would use it to defeat Tigers. They had created an artillery tool that became a tank killer through the ingenuity of crews fighting at point-blank range in conditions that doctrine never contemplated. Sergeant Jim Bauer survived the Battle of Aracourt and continued fighting through the fall and winter of 1944. His Sherman was hit 3 times during those months, twice by Panzerfausts and once by a Panther's 75mm gun. Each time, he and his crew bailed out safely and were assigned a new tank. By war's end, Bauer had been credited with 7 confirmed tank kills, 5 of them using white phosphorus shells. He returned to Columbus, Ohio, in November 1945, received his discharge, and went back to being an auto mechanic. He never spoke much about his time in tanks except to say that fog was better armor than steel plate, and that sometimes the best weapon wasn't the one that hit hardest, but the one that scared the enemy most. The M4 Sherman remained in American service through the Korean War and continued serving with Allied nations into the 1970s. The white phosphorus tactic developed at Aracourt was studied at Fort Knox and incorporated into tank gunnery training. Future generations of tank commanders learned that seeing the enemy first, controlling what the enemy could see, and understanding the psychological dimensions of armored combat often mattered more than technical specifications. The Battle of Aracourt demonstrated an uncomfortable truth about armored warfare that persists to the present day. Technology matters, but it doesn't determine outcomes. Crew quality, tactical flexibility, combined arms coordination, and the ability to exploit environmental conditions often override raw technical superiority. The Sherman tank was inferior to the Panther and Tiger in measurable ways, yet American crews at Aracourt achieved a 6-to-1 kill ratio because they understood their mission, knew the terrain, used weather as a weapon, and were willing to improvise when doctrine failed them. The fog that morning on September 19, 1944, wasn't just weather. It was an equalizer that made long-range combat impossible, that negated optics and muzzle velocity and armor thickness. In that fog, what mattered was training, nerve, and the willingness to engage enemy tanks at ranges where a single mistake meant death. American Sherman crews proved they had all three qualities in abundance, along with one more: the ingenuity to turn an artillery marking round into a psychological weapon that terrorized the best tanks in the German arsenal. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.